What we'll look at now is the life in the ocean, specifically different lifestyles, how organisms live in the seas. So here we go with our PowerPoint and get that started. So there, now it's with us. There's a lot of things in the ocean, quite a variety. After all, most of Earth's surface is ocean, and there's lots of different habitats. We range from the very deep ocean to shallow sunny water, from very cold to quite warm. The bottom may be anywhere from mud to rock. Lots of different possibilities. And there's a lot of different kinds of things living in the ocean. Although we're used to seeing stuff around us on the land, a whole lot of it's bugs. The arthropods, the vertebrates, those are most of the conspicuous land organisms. We've got some snails and slugs and some worms, some microscopic stuff, but most of the kinds of living things are in the ocean, and not nearly as many are up on land. There's a whole lot of insects, but they're all insects. Ways you can be different in the ocean. Finding your own way of doing things tends to help avoid competition, be more successful. Different possible sources of food. Range of size. We have anywhere from teeny tiny microscopic stuff up to giant whales and things like that. And you'll have quite different lifestyles depending on what size you are. Again, different types of habitats. Also, wide range of difference in activity levels, even within the animals. We have some things that are attached in one place and just sit there. Some that are slow moving. Some that float around but can't do much to move themselves. They're just carried by the currents. Some that are very actively moving around, whether they're crawling around the bottom or swimming through the water. So all these mean there are lots of different opportunities in the oceans. One way of getting food is to make your own, photosynthesizing. Of course, this is true of plants. There are a few true plants in the ocean, lots of types of algae. There are also certain types of bacteria that are able to photosynthesize. But to do this, you need light. There's enough light for photosynthesis from the surface down in pretty clear water to about 200 meters maximum depth. Deeper than that, there's too little light getting in to be able to photosynthesize. You've got a few types of algae that are really good at grabbing light and may get a little deeper than that, but that's about it. Up here, familiar on land, photosynthesis is the base of our food chains. We may be eating plants, we may be eating a cow that ate grass, or potentially, especially say if we're eating fish, we may be a few more steps of the food chain. But at the bottom, it's still going to be photosynthesis. In the ocean, this is usually true as well. Most of the ocean depends on photosynthesis as the base of the food chain. Most of the ocean deeper than 200 meters. Now we're getting photosynthesis as the food source down there. Well, stuff up in shallow water can sink. And so much of the deep ocean food chain ultimately depends on stuff that started out in the shallow water and then has sunk down. Here are some examples of ocean photosynthesizer. This is red algae. Conveniently, a number of the major types of algae typically have distinctive colors, so easy way to get a good guess as to what group it is. Here's a brown algae. Both red and brown algae are typically fairly big. You think of them as seaweed, visible. Brown algae includes kelp, which get very, very big. You can probably figure out what group this belongs to. These would be in the green algae. We also have a variety of one-celled algae. These are dinoflagellates. These are diatoms. So these may be floating in the water. They may be sitting on the bottom. Various possibilities for little one-celled things. Some bacteria are able to photosynthesize as well. The most important group of these is the cyanobacteria, or blue-green algae. So these have the very small, simple cells of bacteria, unlike your standard algae that are eukaryotes. They've got a nucleus and other more complex stuff in their cells. Bacteria don't. So this is a photomicrograph showing blue-green algae, but it's colored artificially. That is not blue-green. That's kind of magenta. Blue-green algae are not in the archaea. Archaea are a group, they are prokaryotic like bacteria, very simple cells, but they have quite distinctive chemistry relative to the standard bacteria. They're a very distinctive group. The blue-green algae are not archaea, they are standard eubacteria. Blue-green algae in freshwater include some of the pond scum types of things. Some of these can make water not taste so great, so you don't want the reservoir. Some of them actually produce toxins that can be hazardous to people or animals. So for example, here we've got some pond scum, doesn't look too nice. It's probably got some blue-green algae component. We do have some areas of true plants in the water, such as in the salt marshes with the salt marsh grass. We talked about those a bit already. Dead bits of grass, again, very important food source then for not just right there in the marsh, but it washes into the surrounding water. Also, in among the grass, good places to hide, a lot of food. So if you don't mind the hides changing slanty, all that, it can be a good place for young individuals to hide out and grow until they're big enough to manage in more open water. Besides photosynthesizing, chemosynthesis, taking simple inorganic compounds that have energy-rich bonds to them and using that energy to make food. Certain bacteria and archaea can do this. Energy-rich compounds tend to react with oxygen. And that's a handy way of getting energy from a lot of stuff. That's what our cells do. That's what we do when we burn stuff. So places where there's plenty of oxygen, there's really not much in the way of these energy-rich chemicals. So someplace with not much oxygen, for example, where we've got stuff coming out of the bottom of the ocean, maybe it's hot water that's dissolved minerals from the rock deep down, away from the oxygen, bring that up, the hydrothermal vents, or hydrocarbon seeps. We have places where oil or natural gas is slowly leaking from the seafloor, and slowly enough that bacteria can keep up with eating it. And so it's not a pollution problem where it's naturally occurring. Dump a whole bunch all over the place where it's not normally. That's a problem, but you do have natural occurrence there. And then, well, hey, we can use them for energy, so can bacteria. Although Some of those are more organic, where they quite count as chemosynthesis. Depends on what you're looking at and how you define it. But also, as you get more down in the mud, less water from above oxygen is getting in there. And so deep enough in the mud, you can start to get some of these chemicals present, or any place with stagnant water, like we mentioned, deep in the Black Sea, places in the Mediterranean as well. Here's an example. There's one of those deep sea vents, the black smoker. Of course, a very familiar way of getting your food is what we do: eat something else. Quite a few bacteria and single-celled protist types of things. All animals do this, fungi as well. How exactly do you eat other things? Potentially, you may have symbiosis, where you've got a photosynthetic or chemosynthetic organism living closely associated with you, or even inside you, and you get food from that. Of course, you can eat the plants or algae, be an herbivore. You can eat other animals, be a predator, or leftover bits and pieces, be a detrivore or scavenger type of approach. Example of symbiosis: most of the coral here visible in the background of this view of a reef has photosynthetic diaflagellates living inside the tissue. And so the coral plus diaflagellate together kind of functions like a photosynthetic organism. Now, the corals also grab some stuff out of plankton. They aren't totally relying just on the photosynthesis, but it's a major part of their nutrition. These are foraminifera, little one-celled organisms with a kind of blobby amoeba-like little cell that makes these shells. They're tiny, generally something you can barely see a speck there with your eye without a microscope. And a number of the foraminifera likewise have some sort of symbiotic algae living in with them, providing some of the food. We also have chemosymbiosis, where those chemosynthetic bacteria live in or closely associated with an animal or other organism providing food. One major group of bivalves that has that pattern, okay, that's not liking us. The leucines are a group of clams. They tend to be relatively round in shape and live in a wide range of places in the oceans. And they have chemosynthetic bacteria living inside them. So they actually dig down deep in the mud, and in one direction, they're taking oxygenated water from above, bring it in so they get their oxygen to breathe. They're also bringing up anoxic water from down in the sand or mud beneath them to provide the chemicals that their bacteria need. The clams visible here are two other groups of chemosymbiotic clams. The kind of brown ones are mussels, kind of related to the blue or green mussels that you might encounter as seafood. And then these bigger white ones are vesicomyid clams, also chemosymbiotic, very typical of areas around deep sea vents and hydrocarbon seeps. The crab there, it's got a bunch of bacteria on it that may provide a food, or it may nibble on the clams, be another step up the food chain. These tube worms, very common around some of the deep sea hot springs, and they have lots and lots of those chemosynthetic bacteria living in them. The red structure at the end. And so the worms are getting their food from the bacteria. In fact, they don't have a digestive system, and they're just getting direct nutrients from the bacteria. Good old eat other things and not having symbionts is well, that's what we do, so it's a pretty familiar way of getting food. But there's still many styles there. Among the heterotrophs, things that eat other stuff, some are very, very specialized. And some, if it's in front of them, they eat it type of approach. For example, some types of organisms will be filtering particles out of the water, and anything that's about the right size. Okay, we'll try it, see how it sits in the tummy. Or things may kind of crawl around grazing on whatever's in front of them. It might be algae, might be a sponge, or a coral, a bryozoan, various attached animals. But again, some very targeted in how they feed. Just how do you get your food? What size pieces are you getting? Many ways in which different organisms can be different. Here are some sea urchins that are grazing on kelp. They have a set of 5 hard teeth coming together at the mouth, which is actually on the underside there. And they can munch on a wide range of types of algae. Too many sea urchins and start to run low on the algae. And giant kelp make forest-like habitat for a lot of things. So an outbreak of too many sea urchins can potentially be a problem there. Here's a snail, periwinkle, grazes on kelp or perhaps on the stuff on it. We see this white stuff looks like it's different things, maybe a hydrozoan growing on the kelp, so it may be feeding on that. One type of periwinkle that we have along the coast here, eastern US, actually lives often on the salt marsh grass, Spartina. And what it does, it will chew on the Spartina leaves, but it doesn't like to eat Spartina itself. Once that leaf is damaged, there's a fungus that can grow on the leaf, and the snail comes back and eats the fungus. So it's actually, in a way, doing a simple version of farming, kind of the way leafcutter ants do. These are brachiopods or lamp shells, although they look kind of like clams. These have a top and bottom shell. Clams have a left and right shell. So the animal is actually quite different. They have very small tentacles able to capture little bits of food passing through from the nearby water. The name lamp shell, you probably don't have a lamp like this in your room, but if you think rather earlier, say a biblical style lamp, or the sort of lamp that you might try rubbing to get a genie out of, that's the type of lamp that these are shaped somewhat like. This is a crinoid or sea lily. It's a relative of the starfish and sea urchin, but it stays in one place. You can see the stalk attaching it. Crinoids with stalks today are all in deep water. There are some crinoids that have basically lost the stalk that do a little moving around. Some of those occur in more shallow water. But again, it's got all these arms and tentacles, and it's holding them out in the water, catching whatever bits and pieces drift past for food. These are some barnacles. A baby barnacle starts out as a typical little kind of crustacean, sort of vaguely like a baby shrimp. But as it grows up, it finds a suitable place to settle down, and it will actually glue itself down by the head, and those bits sticking out of the barnacle are the feet that it's kicking in the water to capture food particles. Of course, also help bring water with oxygen in and wash away the water it's carrying away carbon dioxide and waste, things like that. Excuse me. A different point on the size range, whales. We have two feeding styles, two major categories of whales. On the left are the more filter feeding style. Now, it's a range of size of things, but basically the approach of the biggest whales, things like the blue whale, fin whale, as well as some more medium-sized whales, is to gulp in a great big mouthful of stuff and then use the tongue to push the water out and swallow whatever fish or krill or stuff like that that they got. On the right are the toothed whales. Instead of having the baleen used for filtering, these have teeth that they use in catching bigger prey more individually, things like fish and squid. The sperm whale, for example, likes to eat giant squid. Back to smaller filters, these are feather duster worms, popular aquarium animals. So they have the tentacles that wave around in the water to capture food, pop back down into their tubes if they're scared for protection. Jellyfish, a little more action in their food capture. They have stinging cells that are able to help them catch their prey. Now, some of those stings are too weak for us to notice. Some can be powerful enough to even be dangerous to people. And in between, when you've got some that are uncomfy, you don't want to touch them, but not actually a danger. This is a comb jelly, although reminiscent of a jellyfish. It does not have the stinging cells. Instead, it has sticky structures along its tentacles to help it catch its food. But they can be significant predators. This was accidentally demonstrated. A type of comb jelly was accidentally brought into the Black Sea and thrived there and was gobbling up young fish, being a problem for the fisheries. And then another type of comb jelly showed up, and somebody might have helped it because the second comb jelly, it likes to eat the first one. And now with that second one eating the first one, that's helped restore the balance better for the fisheries. Here's a sea otter eating a sea urchin. Sea otters, many other things like to eat sea urchins, even some people do. But of course, you need to have a way of getting through that spiny protection of the outside. Sea otters actually can use a tool. They'll get something, say a sea urchin or clam or the like, sit it on their tummy and bang it with a rock to break it open. But they are particularly good at eating sea urchins, and so having a good population of sea otters helps to make sure the sea urchins don't get too abundant and take over and gobble up all the kelp, like we mentioned earlier. Sea otter fur is very warm, not surprisingly, for being able to live in cool water. And so it's rather popular as a fur that people can use if people want to have furs. So sea otters were significantly overhunted. Populations declined quite drastically. And corresponding boom in sea urchins and dropping kelp and all the things that like to live around the kelp. Now that sea areas are protected and populations are growing, we're seeing some recovery, although there's still challenges. Here's a starfish. Again, this one's trying to eat a sea urchin there. Around it, these bumpy bits are an algae. And from the color, it's a red algae. Bumpy like that, that's specifically a coralline red algae. Certain types of red algae make hard skeletons, somewhat similar to those in coral, and can contribute to building reefs. Here's a barracuda, I mentioned those before, active predator. Streamlined shape, good for darting forward and grabbing something with those big pointy teeth. This is a moon snail. It is an active predator. That kind of wedge-shaped foot allows it to dig readily through sand and mud and find other animals to eat. And if that animal that it catches, and fairly broad foot, it can grab around it pretty well. If it's got a hard shell, no problem. The moon snail is actually able to drill through other shells and get at the animal inside. If at the beach you find a shell, it has this nice little circular hole in it. It was a victim of maybe either a moon snail or else a murex snail. Those are the two main groups that drill the very circular holes to attack their prey. Another group of snails has a very remarkable assortment of ways to get their prey. These actually use a venom harpoon to stab into their prey. Let me see if I can get this working properly. Now, what I'm not sure is how well this is going to be displaying for you in the Zoom. So see how well we get this to work. But okay. The National Geographic site kind of changed things around a bit. Okay, let's see. Here's the. Oh, yeah, that's real good. There we go. Skip ad. Okay, sound back here. So, so the venom in a cone is the video here, and I think it works better for you to run it yourself rather than trying to see it through the system here. So the cone snails have harpoon-like structures. They're actually modified versions of the kind of teeth that many types of mollusks have, but these come off individually and they're hollow to deliver venom. And so the snail can crawl up near something and stab it and inject the venom into it. Now, a lot of these eat worms. It's not that hard to stop your average worm. So that doesn't require too fancy a poison. But some of them feed on other snails, comparable to themselves. So that takes somewhat more strong a venom. And some of those can be dangerous to people as well. Some of them feed on fish. For a snail to stop a fish, it needs something pretty powerful. And those can potentially stop you as well. The cone snails, each one, and there are hundreds of kinds, but each one will have maybe as many as 100 different types of venom in the mix. So quite a wide range of functions there, a lot of interest medically. Are these chemicals things that might potentially be useful? There's already one pain medicine based on cone snail venom that is being used. Different types use different effects. For example, there's one in that video where it stings a fish, and that fish goes into convulsions all over the place and then goes rigid. It's paralyzed, and the snail can then swallow that fish and digest it. But you know, if you were a little fish and all of a sudden your neighbor started doing this sort of thing, you'd notice something's wrong here. Okay. Another type of coon snail likes to eat little fish that hang out in small schools. So it has a bit slower acting venom, but one that just goes straight to paralysis. So it can sneak up and zap that one, and then zap its neighbor, and catch a few at a time. There's even more things the snail's doing. For example, at a recent meeting, I heard a talk where they were observing cone snails, had an aquarium, and this one fish just kind of hit him straight for the cone snail. Well, looks like we had a dumb fish. Then, having video on, monitoring what was happening with the cone snail, then here's this other fish that starts to act a little disoriented, and then it starts to head for the cone snail. This wasn't because the fish was stupid. The cone snail was actually producing chemicals out into the water that were incapacitating the fish and then actually attracting it. So there's lots of things going on. Some of the cone snails use a venom component that functions like insulin. Now, you want some insulin at the right times and places to help you break down the sugar in the bloodstream, but pump a huge amount of extra insulin in there, and total sugar crash, and you crash, and the predator can get you. So there's quite an amazing diversity of different chemicals here. Cone snails are also a rather pretty group. They're quite popular with collectors. They tend to be big and fancy. Besides different types of organisms having different lifestyles, there's often big changes within the lifetime of one individual. A lot of ocean life will start out as eggs, and then even the larvae drifting around as plankton. They may feed on the one-celled algae or on other little planktonic animals and protists and whatnot. But then as they start getting ready to grow up, they'll settle down to the bottom and develop into adults once they're there. Here are a few examples, not looking too much like the adult. Polychaete, that's one of the major groups of ocean worms. This is baby brittle star, similar to a starfish. Little baby crab and snail here. Lots of spines and hairs. And spread out more surface area. That's going to give you more friction, keep you floating, not sinking down. So they're drifting around the water, not sinking to the bottom. Yep. Of course, also that makes you somewhat bigger, a little hard to eat, that type of thing. Here we have comparison with the baby versus the adult on a number of the forms. Well, that's a land snail head and body. There's a difference. Here's a baby oyster. It actually has a foot. When it grows up, it's just stuck in one place. And it doesn't need a foot, so it actually loses the foot as it grows up. But a baby clam like this, or a baby snail's nose, a villager, it has lots of cilia helping it swim around. A common way of feeding in the ocean is to be a detrivore. This is eating bits of dead stuff or waste organic material that's mostly it's sunk down, although some of it may be caught by things while it's still sinking, but a lot of this is on the bottom or maybe buried in the sand and mud. A lot of worm-like things will be detrivores. Well, even up here on land, earthworms tend to be detrivores. There are plenty of types of bacteria in the ocean, like many of the bacteria up here on land. A lot of them are involved in the decay, breaking down of detritus. There are also a variety of marine fungi, characteristically rather small and inconspicuous. We tend to notice fungi up here when they make great big mushrooms. The ones in the ocean don't do that. So unless you're specifically looking for them, most of them are not going to be noticed. Here's one of the many types of worms. This is a segmented polychaete worm, distant cousin of the earthworms. Now, some of the polychaetes actually are active predators. There's a variety of lifestyles, but some of them are filter feeders, like those feather duster worms. But a lot of them are crawling on or digging through the mud or sitting in a tube in the mud and gathering detritus as their food. Sea cucumber, also in the group with sea urchins, starfish, crinoids, whatnot, but a little more worm-shaped. Most of them are crawling along on the bottom and often feeding on detritus. Now, some detritus feeders basically just gulp up the mud and whatever I can digest, great, and what I can't, well, it'll go out the other end. Others are more picky, specifically selecting the better detritus. Well, it's still kind of the leftovers that nothing else wanted previously, but within that, selecting the most promising stuff and being a much more selective deposit feeder. This is a ghost crab. It may be scavenging. Looks like there's some dead algae on the beach there near it. But also it may be hanging out, waiting. A number of crabs use their claws to capture prey. Ghost crab, kind of pale color and often run around the beach at night. So you go on the beach and wait, what was that little white thing? Was it a tiny ghost? No, it's a ghost crab. Sometimes you see them out in the daytime. Also at a beach, if you see a hole in the sand up near the dunes, it's maybe about that big around or so. And often you see kind of little dashes in the sand around it. That will be a ghost crab burrow. The dashes are its footprints. Sand dollars tend to be deposit feeders. These ones here, you can see they're kind of sticking up into the water and able to catch little pieces that wash along and bump into them, but also reaching down into the mud, they can pick up any tasty bits in the sand or mud around them and carry those to their mouth as well. Some types of worms make a burrow that they live in basically permanently. Others are moving around from place to place more or less all the time. Here's an example, a relatively permanent water can wash in one part, out the other. So the animal is getting fresh water, I mean, in a sense of not stale, it's salty, but new water to it, carrying more oxygen, and then washes away the carbon dioxide, other waste. It may be getting food from the water, or perhaps from the surrounding mud. Different ones do different things. Filter feeding, a lot of organisms do that, but you need plenty there to eat. If you have something that would normally filter feed, but you're living someplace where there's not much little plankton to filter, what could you do? For example, in the deep ocean, these characteristically are places with relatively little food available. To get all the way to the deep ocean, any food has to pass a lot of mouths coming down. Well, if there's not little stuff, maybe you need to go for something a bit bigger. Some things that we think of as filter feeders, standard for the shallow stuff, can actually grab larger things in deeper water. For example, sponges, those are normally filtering like bacteria-sized stuff out of the water. But there are certain types of mostly deep sea sponges, or say in caves in the ocean where there's not much other food, that are able to snag passing small animals and grow over and digest them. So the deep sea corals have extra big tentacles catching bigger food. Some deep sea clams and sea squirts likewise. Here's one of those deep sea sponges catching a little tiny shrimp-like animal and gradually growing over, trapping it. One of those deep sea squirts. It's basically kind of a live trap, sits there open like that. What would normally be a siphon for just bringing in water and filtering, now can close quickly whenever a small animal comes along. And likewise, there's a whole group, or maybe a couple groups, it's not entirely clear if they're all closely related to each other, of clams in deep ocean that will be able to slurp up again some small crustacean like near it. Most clams are filtering algae out of the water, but this one's slurping up something larger and digesting it, and it's correspondingly got a strong muscular stomach to crunch up that poor little crustacean. Okay, so examples, a lot of different types of lifestyles in the oceans.